At 1,230 hours on the 1st of February 1943, Lieutenant Kenneth Bragg white-knuckled the yoke of the B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 124406. At 20,000 feet above the Tunisian landscape, the air was thin and brutally cold, dipping to minus 40 degrees Celsius, biting through the sheepskin flight jackets of the crew. The heavy bomber, christened the All-American, was leading the formation of the 414th Bombardment Squadron on a strike mission against German-controlled ports in Bizerte and Tunis. But Bragg did not know that in mere seconds, the very definitions of aerodynamics and aviation survival were about to be completely rewritten. The North African sky was a piercing blue that day, ideal conditions for a bombardier, but a death sentence for concealment. Out of the sun, tiny black specks began to materialize. They were Luftwaffe Messerschmitt B-17 fighters, their noses painted the distinctive yellow of the Jagdschwader. They weren't loitering. They were diving in a direct head-on attack, the dreaded 12 o'clock high tactic that terrified bomber crews the most. Bragg tightened his grip, eyes glued to the windscreen. A B-17 74 feet long, with a 103-foot wingspan and laden with tons of bombs, could not maneuver like a fighter. His job was to hold a tight formation so the ship's 50-caliber machine guns could create an interlocking wall of defensive fire. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone R 1,820 engines mixed with the staccato thumping of the top turret and chin turret guns. Hot brass casings rained down onto the freezing metal floor with a metallic clatter. 2 Bf-109 seconds broke from the enemy formation and barreled straight toward the All-American. The first raked the left wing with machine gun fire before banking sharply downward. But the second, piloted by German ace Erich Paccia, made a fatal error, or perhaps he was already dead at the stick. In the moment of the head-on pass, the B-17's nose gunner and top turret gunner had unleashed a storm of lead into the German fighter. From the cockpit, Bragg saw the Bf-109 take hits, black smoke pouring from its engine. By reflex, Paccia should have pulled up to vault over the B-17 or dived beneath it. But the fighter had lost control. It was closing at a combined speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. It was no longer a machine of war. It was a 3-ton metal projectile, aiming directly for Bragg's cockpit. "Look out!" The co-pilot's scream tore through the intercom. Bragg instinctively shoved the yoke forward to dip the nose, a desperate split-second bid to avoid a head-on collision. That action saved his life and the co-pilot's, but it could not save the plane. A deafening, concussive boom ripped through the sky. It wasn't the sound of flak or bombs. It was the terrifying shriek of metal grinding against metal, the tearing of duralumin, and the snapping of structural spars. The massive bomber shuddered violently, as if it had slammed into an invisible wall in midair. Bragg was thrown forward, his harness digging into his chest. For a second, there was silence. Then came the sound of wind, a ghastly, howling sound, not the air rushing over the wings, but wind screaming inside the fuselage through a massive breach. The German Bf-109, in its death roll, had missed the cockpit. Instead, its left wing had sliced clean through the rear fuselage of the B-17, just behind the waist gunners and forward of the tail gunners' position. The impact was so catastrophic that the German fighter disintegrated into pieces and plummeted to the desert floor, taking its pilot with it. But on the All-American, the nightmare was just beginning. Bragg fought to stabilize the bucking aircraft. The controls vibrated violently in his hands. He looked at his co-pilot. Both their faces were pale beneath their oxygen masks. They were still flying. The engines were still turning. But the feel of the plane, something was wrong. It felt sluggish, heavy, and unstable, as if it wanted to snap in half at any moment. "Report damage. Can anyone hear me? Report!" Bragg shouted into his mic. From the rear, a voice crackled over the radio, trembling with panic. "Lieutenant, the tail. The tail is almost gone." Bragg felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't turn around to look, but what the waist gunner described defied every law of combat survivability. The collision had severed almost the entire rear fuselage. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely gone. A massive diagonal gash had sliced the fuselage from the top spine down to the belly, exposing the empty air. The tail section of the B-17, housing the elevators, the rudder, and most critically, Tail gunner Sam Sarpolus was now attached to the main fuselage by nothing more than a few twisted metal spars and a thin strip of aluminum skin on the bottom floor. It was swaying in the slipstream. The entire heavy tail section was literally dangling, waiting to tear free and plummet into the abyss below. The All-American was still flying, but it had become a walking corpse, and Bragg, with numb hands on the yoke, was piloting a flying coffin at 20,000 feet, deep inside enemy territory, with a tail that could snap off if he made a mistake measured in inches. Inside the tail gunner's compartment, Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus was no longer flying in an aircraft. He was riding a pendulum of death. The impact had thrown him violently against the armor plating, dazing him. When he shook off the concussion and looked forward, his blood turned to ice. Where the fuselage tunnel should have been, the narrow crawlway leading back to the waist gunners, there was now only bright blue sky and the terrifying sight of the Tunisian desert 4 miles below. The tail section was oscillating. With every buffet of the wind, the entire rear structure swung several feet to the left, then twisted back to the right. Sarpolus was trapped in a metal cage that was physically disconnected from the rest of the bomber, save for a few tenuous strips of aluminum and one shattered longitudinal spar at the bottom of the fuselage. Sam, are you there? The voice of waist gunner Michael Zook cracked over the intercom, barely audible over the roaring wind. I'm here, Sarpolus replied, his voice surprisingly calm. But I don't think I can get to you. The floor is gone. Forward of the breach, the rest of the crew stared in horror at the damage. The gash was massive, nearly 16 feet long diagonally. The left horizontal stabilizer and elevator had been completely sheared off by the German fighter's wing. The vertical stabilizer, the tail fin, was canted at a sickening angle. The only thing keeping the tail from snapping off was the slipstream itself, which seemed to be pushing the broken section back against the fuselage and the sheer structural tenacity of the Boeing airframe. Up in the cockpit, Bragg was fighting a losing battle with physics. The loss of the left stabilizer meant the aircraft wanted to roll violently to the right and pitch up uncontrollably. The control cables to the rudder were slack, likely severed or jammed. He had almost no yaw control. Don't move, Bragg ordered the crew, his voice steel. Nobody move a muscle. If you shift the center of gravity even an inch, the torque might snap the tail off. The B-17 was now flying on differential power. Bragg had to throttle back the engines on the left wing and firewall the engines on the right just to keep the nose straight. The All-American was crabbing through the air, flying sideways like a wounded crab, losing altitude and speed with every passing second. But the laws of gravity weren't the only enemy. The Luftwaffe was not done. The remaining Bf 109 seconds in the German formation had watched the collision. They saw the All-American shudder, its tail hanging by a thread, smoke trailing from the impact zone. To a fighter pilot, a crippled bomber straggling behind its formation is the ultimate prize, a lame duck. They circled back, their engines whining as they lined up for the kill. They smelled blood. Fighters, 6 o'clock high. The top turret gunner screamed. This was the nightmare scenario. Normally, the B-17's defense relied on its porcupine formation, hundreds of heavy machine guns creating a zone of death. But the All-American was falling out of formation. It was alone. And worst of all, the crew couldn't fight back effectively. Hold your fire, Bragg shouted. Short bursts only. The recoil. It was a terrifying realization. The B-17 carried 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. These weapons produced massive recoil vibration when fired. If the waist gunners or the tail gunner opened up with long, continuous bursts, the violent shaking of the airframe could be the final straw that severed the remaining metal holding the tail. They literally risked shooting their own tail off by defending themselves. The German fighters dove. Tracers zipped past the cockpit and punched holes in the wings. They were targeting the engines, trying to strip the All-American of its remaining power. In the severed tail, Sarpolus made a decision. He was isolated, swinging in the wind, with enemy fighters lining up directly behind him to finish the job. He couldn't crawl forward to safety because the floor was gone. He couldn't bail out because the slipstream would likely smash him into the broken debris, and his parachute harness might be snagged. He did the only thing a tail gunner could do. He grabbed the handles of his twin, 50 calibers. As a Bf-109 closed in for a finishing pass, aiming right down the throat of the broken bomber, Sarpolus opened fire. He fired in short, disciplined bursts, thump, 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 praying that the vibration wouldn't detach his compartment from the plane. The German pilot, expecting an easy kill against a helpless wreck, was shocked to see the dead tail spitting fire. Tracers from Sarpolus's guns walked up the nose of the Messerschmitt. The German broke off his attack sharply, diving away to avoid the defiant fire. But the stress on the airframe was critical. With every burst of the guns, the crew in the waist section watched the tail groan and twist. The gap in the fuselage widened and closed like a breathing mouth. The metal shrieked, a high-pitched banshee wail that could be heard over the engines. They were still 300 miles from their base in Biskra, Algeria. They were alone, under attack, and flying a plane that was technically already destroyed. And now, they had to cross the Atlas Mountains. The skies over Tunisia finally fell silent, save for the droning of the engines and the sickening screech of metal grinding against metal. The German Bf-109 seconds, likely low on fuel or ammunition, or perhaps simply unable to comprehend how their target was still airborne, banked their wings and turned back toward their bases in Tunis. One German pilot, as he peeled away, slowed his fighter alongside the All-American. He stared at the gaping wound in the bomber's fuselage, shook his head in disbelief, and dove away. He knew he didn't need to waste another bullet. Gravity would finish the job for him. Lieutenant Bragg watched the enemy vanish, but he felt no relief. The battle with the Luftwaffe was over. The battle with the Atlas Mountains was just beginning. "Navigator, give me a heading for Biskra," Bragg ordered. "And keep us away from the high peaks. We can't climb." "Heading 240, Lieutenant," came the reply. "But we're losing altitude fast. We're down to 14,000. The B-17 was behaving like a creature in its death throes. With the horizontal stabilizer gone on one side and the vertical fin twisted, the aircraft had lost its longitudinal stability. It began to exhibit a terrifying phenomenon known as fishtailing. The nose and the tail were moving independently of each other. When Bragg corrected the nose to the left, the severed tail section would swing violently to the right, delayed by a second, causing a sickening lurch that rippled through the entire airframe. From the waist gunner's position, Sergeant Michael Zook watched this hypnotic, terrifying dance. The tear in the fuselage was breathing. As the plane pitched up, the gap at the top of the fuselage would widen to nearly 4 feet. As the plane pitched down, the jagged metal edges would slam back together with a bone-jarring crunch. The only structural integrity remaining was the bottom keel of the aircraft, a strip of metal less than 2 feet wide. "It's waving at us, Lieutenant," Zook reported, his voice hollow. "The tail, it's flapping like a bird's wing." Bragg knew what that meant. Metal fatigue. Aluminum alloys are strong, but they are not designed to bend back and forth repeatedly. Like a paperclip bent too many times, the remaining spars were heating up, weakening, and preparing to snap. "Sarpolus," Bragg called back to the tail gunner. "Status." "I'm still here, sir," Sarpolus replied. "But it's getting colder back here. The wind is tearing everything apart." Sarpolus was essentially riding in a detached capsule. He had tried to crawl forward toward the waist section, but the floor was gone. A chasm of open air separated him from his crewmates. If he tried to jump across the gap, a sudden lurch of the tail could throw him out into the slipstream without a parachute deployment. He was trapped on an island of aluminum, drifting through the sky. Bragg looked at his instrument panel. Fuel was sufficient, but oil pressure in the No. 3 engine was dropping. The vibration from the loose tail was shaking the engines in their mounts. He had a decision to make, the kind of decision that haunts commanders for the rest of their lives. Standard operating procedure for a B-17 with catastrophic structural damage was clear. Bail out immediately. Get the crew out before the plane disintegrates. Every second they stayed on board was a gamble with 10 lives. "Crew, listen up," Bragg's voice was calm, masking the adrenaline flooding his system. "The damage is critical. We are losing altitude. I am ordering everyone to put on their chutes and prepare to bail out." There was a pause. Then, the voice of the bombardier, Ralph Burbridge, came from the nose. "Sir, if we bail out, the shift and wait. When we leave our positions, the plane might pitch up and snap the tail off instantly." It was a valid point, but there was a darker truth they all knew but hadn't said aloud. If the crew bailed out, the plane would become uncontrollable. It would crash, and Sam Sarpolus, trapped in the tail, would go down with it. He couldn't get out safely on his own. Abandoning the ship meant killing the tail gunner. "We can't leave him, sir," Zook said from the waist. "We can't get him out, but we can't leave him." Bragg gripped the yoke until his knuckles turned white. He felt the weight of the All-American in his hands, heavy, unresponsive, dying. He thought of the empty desert below, the waiting German patrols, and the man trapped in the tail section 40 feet behind him. "Belay that order," Bragg said. "We stick together. Nobody leaves this plane unless the wings come off." A collective exhale went through the intercom. It was a suicide pact, signed in the sky. They would fly the All-American until it touched the ground or disintegrated into dust. To keep the tail attached, Bragg had to fly with extreme gentleness. No sudden turns, no banking greater than 5 degrees. He had to anticipate the air currents coming off the mountains. The Atlas Range loomed ahead, rugged peaks rising to 7,000 feet. They were currently at 12,000 and dropping 500 feet per minute. The math was becoming a countdown. "We need to stiffen the fuselage," Zook suggested. "If we can tie it together," it sounded ridiculous. Tying a 30-ton bomber together with rope? But desperation breeds innovation. The waist gunners grabbed the parachute cords from the spare chutes. They began to loop the strong nylon cords around the structural ribs of the waist section, trying to bridge the gap, trying to pull the two halves of the plane tighter together. It was a futile gesture against the forces of aerodynamics, but it gave them something to do something other than watching the metal tear. As they approached the foothills, the turbulence increased. The All-American groaned. The tail swung wider 3 feet to the left, 3 feet to the right. Bragg fought the yoke, sweat pouring into his eyes despite the freezing cold. He wasn't just flying a plane anymore. He was balancing a falling building. The Atlas Mountains rose up to meet them like a wall of jagged teeth. For a healthy B-17, crossing this range was a routine navigational task. For the All-American, it was a game of Russian roulette played with gravity. "Altitude?" Bragg barked, his voice tight. 9,000 feet and dropping, the navigator replied. "The pass ahead is at 8,005. It's going to be tight, Kenneth, real tight." They couldn't climb. Every time Bragg pulled back on the yoke to gain altitude, the increased angle of attack put massive stress on the fractured tail section. The aerodynamic drag from the gaping hole in the fuselage acted like a giant air brake, sucking the energy out of the plane. They had to fly through the mountains, not over them. They had to thread the needle. As they entered the mountain pass, the air currents changed instantly. The smooth air of the high desert was replaced by the violent churning turbulence of the peaks. Updrafts and downdrafts slammed into the bomber. Crack! A sound like a gunshot echoed through the fuselage. "What was that?" Bragg shouted. "The spar," Zook screamed from the waist. "The bottom spar just bent. I can see the metal buckling." The turbulence had twisted the tail section so violently that the single remaining structural beam running along the floor was starting to yield. In the tail compartment, Sam Sarpolus was being tossed around like a die in a cup. He gripped his guns, staring out at the rock walls of the canyon that were now whizzing by on either side. He was close enough to see the texture of the granite. "Hold it together," Bragg whispered to himself, or perhaps to the plane. "Just hold it together." He fought the controls with a physical intensity that was rapidly draining his strength. The B-17 wanted to roll over and die. The missing stabilizer meant that the lift was uneven. The right wing was generating more lift than the left, constantly trying to flip the plane onto its back. Bragg had to hold full left aileron and full right rudder, a cross-control input that was exhausting and unnatural. His left arm was numb. His right leg was trembling from the pressure on the rudder pedal. In the waist section, the crew members were performing an act of desperation that defied logic. They were literally trying to hold the plane together with their bare hands. They had tied the parachute cords to the ribs of the severed tail section and were pulling forward, bracing their feet against the bulkheads. It was a human chain trying to fight the laws of physics. "Heave!" Zook yelled. "Keep it tight! Don't let it sway!" It was absurd. 4 men pulling on nylon cords against the weight of a 2-ton tail section buffeted by mountain winds. But it provided a tiny fraction of stability, a dampener against the oscillations. More importantly, it kept them from going insane with fear. The All-Americans scraped over the crest of the pass with less than 300 feet of clearance. The downdraft on the other side hit them like a hammer, dropping the plane 500 feet in seconds. The stomach-churning drop elicited screams from the crew, but the tail held. The metal groaned, the rivets popped, but the aluminum skin did not tear. They emerged from the mountains into the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert. The hard part was over, or so they thought. But now, a new enemy emerged. Time. They were still an hour away from the airfield at Biskra. The adrenaline that had fueled them during the combat and the mountain crossing was beginning to fade, replaced by the crushing weight of exhaustion and the biting cold. The hole in the fuselage was a wind tunnel. The temperature inside the plane was indistinguishable from the outside air, well below freezing. Bragg noticed something disturbing on his instrument panel. The oil temperature on the No. 4 engine was rising. The vibration was shaking, the engine mounts loose. If he lost an engine on the right side, the side generating the lift that countered the missing tail, the imbalance would be uncorrectable. The plane would spin. "Engineer," Bragg said, his voice raspy. "Watch No. 4. If it spikes, we feather it immediately. I don't care if we lose speed. We can't take the vibration." Back in the tail, Sarpolus was silent. The cold had seeped into his bones. He was huddled over his guns, watching the desert floor speed by. He knew that the most dangerous part of the flight was yet to come: landing. A B-17 landing puts massive stress on the tail wheel. The shock of touchdown reverberates through the entire airframe. With the structure compromised, the moment the main wheels touch the ground, the tail might simply snap off and slam into the runway, crushing him instantly. He was the only man on board who knew he might survive the flight, only to die on the runway. The oasis of Biskra appeared on the horizon like a hallucination shimmering in the heat. To the men of the 97th Bomb Group, waiting on the ground, the return of the mission aircraft was a routine ritual. They counted the dots in the sky, checking them against the departure roster. One by one, the fortresses peeled off and landed, their tires screeching against the steel matting of the runway. But one dot was lagging behind. It was flying low, slow, and erratically. "Tower to aircraft on approach. Identify yourself," the radio operator called out. "This is all American." Bragg's voice came through, static-filled and exhausted. "Emergency. We are coming in hot. Clear the strip. I repeat, clear the strip." The tower operator grabbed his binoculars. What he saw made him drop his coffee mug. The aircraft approaching the field didn't look like a B-17. It looked like two separate pieces of scrap metal flying in close formation. The fuselage was bent like a boomerang. The tail section was literally flapping in the wind, moving independently of the wings. "Emergency vehicles," the operator screamed into the phone. "Roll everything. Fire, medical, crash trucks. Now." On the ground, mechanics and pilots stopped their work. They stood frozen, shielding their eyes from the sun, watching the monstrosity descend. It was a sight that defied aerodynamic logic. The plane was crabbing at a 20-degree angle to the runway, just to fly straight. Inside the cockpit, Bragg was performing a delicate surgical procedure with a 30-ton scalpel. Landing a B-17 usually involved a 3-point touchdown, dropping the main wheels and the tail wheel simultaneously, but Bragg knew that was impossible. If the tail wheel hit the ground with any force, the impact would snap the remaining spars. The tail would collapse, crushing Sarpolus, and likely cartwheeling the entire bomber into a fireball. He had to perform a wheel landing, touching down on the main gear first, and keeping the tail flying in the air as long as possible until the speed bled off. "Sarpolus," Bragg said, his voice softer now. "Brace yourself. This is going to be rough. Keep your head down." "I'm ready, Lieutenant," Sarpolus replied. In the tail, the sensation of speed was terrifying. The ground was rushing up at 100 miles per hour, just feet below his boots. He could see the individual rocks in the sand. The vibration was so intense that his vision was blurring. He was sitting in the crumple zone. Bragg cut the throttle. The engines popped and sputtered as the manifold pressure dropped. The All-American sank toward the runway. "Speed, 110, 105, the co-pilot called out. "Watch the stall, watch the stall." If they stalled now, the tail would drop like a stone. Bragg fought the instinct to pull back hard on the yoke. He had to fly it onto the ground. The main wheels kissed the runway. There was a screech of rubber, smoke puffing up from the tires. The plane bounced once, a heart-stopping moment where the tail whipped violently downward, but Bragg caught it. He held the nose forward, forcing the main wheels to stick. Now came the most dangerous part, the brakes. If he braked too hard, the nose would dip and the tail would whip up, snapping the spine. If he didn't brake hard enough, they would run off the end of the runway into the soft sand, which would tear the gear off. The B-17 roared down the runway, its tail still held high in the air by the lift of the slipstream. It looked like a predator refusing to let its prey touch the ground. Behind them, ambulances were already chasing the plane, their sirens wailing. "Tail coming down!" Bragg shouted. "Easy! Easy!" As the speed dropped below 60 miles per hour, the lift evaporated. Gravity reclaimed its debt. The tail section, weighing thousands of pounds and holding a human life, began to settle toward the earth. In the waist, Zook and the others hauled on the parachute cords with the last ounces of their strength, as if their muscles alone could cushion the impact. Thud. The tail wheel hit the steel matting. A sickening crunch echoed through the fuselage. The plane shuddered. For a split second, everyone waited for the sound of tearing metal, the feeling of the rear section breaking away and tumbling down the runway. But the All-American held. Bragg applied the brakes gently, bringing the beast to a halt at the very end of the strip. The propellers spun down to a stop. The silence that followed was louder than the engines had ever been. They were down. They were alive. But when the ground crews rushed to the plane, nobody cheered. They just stared in horror. The propellers of the All-American spun down, the roar of the Wright cyclones fading into the dry, hissing silence of the Algerian desert. For a long moment, no one moved. The ambulance crews, who had raced alongside the bomber as it landed, stood by their vehicles, stretchers in hand, waiting for the worst. They expected to pull bodies from the wreckage. They did not expect the hatches to open. First came the waist gunners, dropping from the fuselage door. They hit the sand and didn't stand up immediately. They fell to their knees. It wasn't clear if they were praying or simply unable to support their own weight after 3 hours of terror. Then came Bragg and his co-pilot, climbing down from the nose hatch, their flight suits soaked through with sweat despite the freezing altitude. But all eyes were fixed on the tail. Sam Sarpolus, the man who had ridden the pendulum, had to be helped down. When his boots touched the solid earth of Biskra, he turned around to look at his station for the first time from the outside. His knees buckled. What he saw, what they all saw, made the blood drain from their faces. From the inside, they knew the damage was bad. But from the outside, it was impossible. The B-17 was nearly cut in two. The jagged tear went from the top of the fuselage, sliced diagonally down through the waist window, and stopped just inches from the bottom of the plane. The entire tail section, weighing over 2,000 pounds, was held in place by a single, twisted longeron, a structural beam on the bottom of the fuselage, no wider than a man's hand, and a few shreds of aluminum skin. "Don't touch it!" a crew chief screamed as a mechanic reached out to inspect the damage. "For God's sake, don't touch it! It might fall off!" It was not an exaggeration. As the desert wind blew across the airfield, the tail section of the parked bomber actually swayed. The structure was so compromised that the mere breeze was moving it. The gathered crowd of pilots, mechanics, and officers stood in a semicircle, maintaining a respectful distance, as if the aircraft were a dangerous beast that might still bite. General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 12th Air Force at the time, was reportedly on the base or nearby. Legend says that when he saw the All-American, he stared at it for a long time, chewing his cigar, before saying, "I don't know how it flew. I don't know how it landed. But I know I'm glad it was built by Boeing." Mechanics climbed onto stands to inspect the repair job the crew had attempted in midair. They saw the parachute cord's bright white nylon lines strung tightly between the ribs of the broken fuselage. It was a desperate, primitive attempt to hold a modern war machine together. An engineer later calculated that the cords offered almost no structural benefit against the forces of flight. But psychologically, they had saved the crew's sanity. "Look at this." The line chief pointed to the single remaining spar. "The metal is crystallized." The aluminum beam that had held the plane together showed signs of extreme metal fatigue. It had bent back and forth thousands of times during the flight. The engineers estimated that the All-American could not have survived even one more turn, one more minute of turbulence, or a slightly harder landing. The metal was at its absolute breaking point. It had held on just long enough to deliver 10 men to safety, and not a second longer. The photographers arrived. They snapped the black and white photos that would become iconic in aviation history. One photo, taken from the rear, showed the fuselage twisted so badly that the tail gunner's compartment was visibly misaligned with the cockpit. It looked like a broken toy. Sam Sarpolus stood staring at the gap. He realized that for the last 90 minutes, the only thing between him and a 20,000-foot freefall was a piece of metal the width of a ruler. He reached into his flight jacket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and tried to light one. His hands were shaking so violently that a ground crewman had to light it for him. "You're the luckiest son of a bitch in North Africa," the crewman said. Sarpolus dragged deep on the cigarette and exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Luck didn't fly this plane," he whispered, looking at the nose art of the All-American. "She did. She refused to die." The B-17 Flying Fortress was known for its ruggedness. Pilots loved it because it could take punishment and bring them home. But the All-American had redefined what punishment meant. It wasn't just a machine anymore. In the eyes of the men at Biskra, it had a soul. However, the laws of war are unsentimental. The All-American had flown its last mission. The damage was structurally irreparable. The spine of the aircraft was severed. It would never bomb Germany again. It would never soar over the Atlas Mountains. But its final duty was not over yet. As the sun began to set over the airfield, turning the desert sand a deep red, the engineers began to discuss what to do with the carcass. They wouldn't scrap it immediately. No, they needed to study it. They needed to understand why it hadn't crashed. Because if they could understand this miracle, maybe they could build the next generation of bombers to be even tougher. While the All-American sat silent on the tarmac at Biskra, rapidly becoming a shrine for every Allied airman in North Africa, another story was beginning to unfold, one captured on film. During the flight home, a navigator from a neighboring B-17 inches, the formation had snapped a photograph of Bragg's crippled bomber. He hadn't expected the film to show a survival story. He had taken the picture to document what he thought were the final moments of a doomed aircraft. He expected to capture the tail snapping off and the fuselage spiraling into the mountains. Instead, he captured a miracle. When the film was developed in the dark room of the 97th Bomb Group, the technicians couldn't believe their eyes. The image was grainy, black and white, but starkly clear. It showed the All-American flying straight and level, high above the rugged terrain, with a slash in its fuselage so deep that the sunlight from the other side was clearly visible through the gap. It looked like a magic trick. It looked like a ghost ship. That photograph didn't just stay in the archives. It traveled. It went from the base commander's desk to 12th Air Force headquarters, then to the Pentagon, and finally to the boardroom of the Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle. For Boeing, the image was vindication. For years, they had claimed the B-17 was the toughest plane in the sky. Now, they had irrefutable proof. They printed the photo with a simple caption: "It came home." It became one of the most famous images of the war, a symbol of American resilience and engineering prowess. It told the public, your sons are flying in tanks, not planes. But for the crew of the All-American, the photo was not a marketing tool. It was a source of retrospective terror. That evening, in the officers' mess tent, someone brought a print of the photo to Lieutenant Bragg and his co-pilot. They were sitting at a wooden table, nursing mugs of lukewarm coffee laced with medicinal whiskey. The adrenaline had crashed hours ago, leaving them in a state of numb exhaustion. Bragg took the photo. He stared at it for a long time. His hand, which had been steady enough to land a broken bomber, began to tremble. "My God," he whispered. "We were flying in that?" From the cockpit, they had felt the vibration. They had fought the controls, but they hadn't seen the profile. They hadn't seen that the tail section was drooping, held only by the floor beams. Seeing it from the outside broke the psychological dam that survival instinct had built. "If I had known it looked like that," the co-pilot muttered, his face pale, "I would have bailed out. I would have defied the order and jumped." It was a sentiment shared by the entire crew. Ignorance had been their co-pilot. If they had known the true extent of the structural failure, if they had known that the laws of physics said they should be dead, panic might have set in. They might have made a sudden move. They might have given up. The engineers who examined the wreck confirmed this fear. Their preliminary report was a document of disbelief. They calculated the drag, the lift coefficients, And the structural load, the math didn't add up. By all rights, the lead engineer told Bragg the next morning, the tail should have twisted off the moment you hit the slipstream of the mountains. The fact that the control cables didn't snap is a statistical anomaly. The fact that the rear gunner survived the oscillation is, well, it's not engineering. It's divine intervention. But divine intervention leaves scars. Sam Sarpolus, the tail gunner, didn't go to the mess hall that night. He sat on his cot in the barracks, staring at the canvas ceiling. He could still feel the swaying. He could still feel the cold wind of the open fuselage. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Messerschmitt diving at him, and then the terrifying emptiness where the floor used to be. He had faced the enemy, and he had faced the abyss. He had fired his guns while suspended over nothingness. In the silence of the barracks, the reality of the war hit him harder than the collision itself. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a survivor of something that shouldn't have happened. The All-American was done fighting, but for the crew, a new battle was starting. They had to get back into the air. In the Army Air Forces, surviving a miracle didn't earn you a ticket home. It just meant you were available for the next mission. The squadron commander came to see them. He praised their skill. He promised them medals. But then came the question they all dreaded. "We have a mission to Palermo in 2 days," the commander said. "We're short on crews. Can you fly?" Bragg looked at his men. They were young in their early 20s. They looked 10 years older than they had that morning. They were shaken. They were terrified. But they were the crew of the All-American. "Give us a new plane, Colonel," Bragg said quietly, "and we'll fly." They had survived the impossible. Now they had to survive the routine. They had to climb back into a B-17, knowing exactly how fragile these metal birds could be, and fly straight back into the flak. The All-American was eventually repaired, a feat of engineering almost as impressive as the flight itself. Ground crews replaced the entire tail section, spliced the severed fuselage, and reinforced the spine. She flew again, mostly as a hack aircraft for transport and light duties, serving until the end of the war before being unceremoniously scrapped in 1945. Like many veterans, she was discarded when the fighting stopped. Her metal melted down to build the appliances of the post-war boom. But the crew of the All-American carried the ghost of that flight for the rest of their lives. They completed their tour of duty. They climbed back into other B-17 seconds, flew through other flak fields, and dropped bombs on other targets. But the bond forged in the freezing skies over Tunisia was unbreakable. They had shared a secret that no one else on Earth could fully understand. The feeling of cheating death when the odds were mathematically zero. Kenneth Bragg, the pilot who held a broken plane together with sheer willpower, received the Silver Star. So did the co-pilot. The rest of the crew were decorated for their calmness under fire. But medals are just pieces of ribbon and metal. The real reward was the silence in the barracks at night, the quiet realization that they were still breathing. The photograph of the All-American became more than just a picture. It became a symbol of the 8th and 12th Air Forces. It was pinned to the bulletin boards of flight schools in Texas and California. Instructors would point to the gaping hole in the fuselage and tell young cadets, "This is why you fly a Fortress. She will bring you home." It became a psychological weapon. It told American airmen that they were invincible. It told them that German cannon shells could tear them apart, but American steel would hold. It was a lie. Of course, thousands of B-17 seconds were shot down, burning and disintegrating, but it was a necessary lie. It gave men the courage to zip up their flight suits and walk to the flight line, day after day. For the German Luftwaffe, the All-American was a terrifying omen. Intelligence reports suggest that German pilots who saw the photo were demoralized. How could they defeat an enemy whose machines refused to fall? Erich Paccia, the German ace who rammed the bomber, was buried in the desert, a casualty of a war that was slowly turning against the Third Reich. His sacrifice had failed. The All-American had survived. Decades later, at reunions of the 97th Bomb Group, the story would be told again. Old men, their hands shaking with age rather than adrenaline, would recount the vibration, the cold, and the sight of Sam Sarpolus swinging in the tail. They would laugh about the parachute cords used to tie the plane together. But underneath the laughter was a profound respect for the machine. The B-17 was not just a collection of rivets and aluminum. To that generation, it was a vessel of salvation. It was the only thing standing between them and the abyss. The story of the All-American asks us a question today. What creates that kind of resilience? Was it the engineering of Boeing? Was it the skill of Kenneth Bragg? Or was it the refusal of 10 men to abandon one another? When Bragg refused the order to bail out because it would have killed his tail gunner, he defined the ethos of the American combat soldier. The mission mattered. The plane mattered. But the man next to you mattered more. In the end, the All-American didn't land safely because of aerodynamics. Physics demanded it crash. It landed because 10 men willed it to fly. They held it together with their hands, their hearts, and their absolute refusal to let go of each other. That is the legacy of the All-American. It is not a story about a plane that wouldn't crash. It is a story about a brotherhood that wouldn't break. In the weeks following the miraculous landing, the All-American ceased to be a combat aircraft and became a crime scene of physics. Boeing dispatched a team of field engineers from Seattle to Algeria. Their job was not to repair the plane that was deemed impossible for combat duty, but to perform an autopsy on a machine that had refused to die. They set up a perimeter around the aircraft. They measured the stress fractures with micrometers. They took samples of the aluminum skin. What they found was terrifying. The main longitudinal spar, the spine of the aircraft, had not just been bent, it had been severed in 3 places. The entire tail section had been held aloft by a section of metal skin no thicker than a few sheets of paper, according to the lead engineer's report. But the most chilling discovery was in the vertical stabilizer. When they removed the inspection panels, they found that the control cables for the rudder and elevators had been frayed down to their last few strands. If Lieutenant Bragg had pushed the rudder pedal just a fraction of an inch harder during the landing, if the wind over the Atlas Mountains had been 5 knots faster, those strands would have snapped. The engineers wrote a classified memo to the War Department. It stated simply, "We cannot replicate the structural adhesion of this aircraft in a wind tunnel. By all mathematical models, the tail should have detached 1.5 seconds after impact." Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the story of the All-American was having a very different effect. German intelligence officers had interviewed the wingman of Erich Paccia, the pilot who died ramming the bomber. The Luftwaffe pilots reported that they had seen the B-17 cut in half. They had reported it as a confirmed kill. But then, Allied radio broadcasts began to circulate. The photo appeared in neutral newspapers. The confirmed kill had come back to life. For the Luftwaffe High Command, this was a psychological disaster. Their pilots were flying fragile Messerschmitts that could explode from a few hits, while the Americans were flying fortresses that could survive being sawed in half. It fed into a growing sense of futility among German aviators. "It is like shooting at a flying tank," one captured German pilot later remarked during interrogation. "You shoot them, they burn, pieces fall off, and they keep flying. It makes you wonder if they are even made of metal, or if they are held together by witchcraft." Back at Biskra, the crew of the All-American was trying to process the autopsy results. They stood under the wing as the Boeing engineers explained just how close they had come to death. "You see this?" An engineer pointed to a rivet line that had stretched but not popped. This rivet held 400% of its rated load. It shouldn't have held, but it did. Kenneth Bragg, the pilot, ran his hand along the scarred aluminum. He realized then that the machine wasn't just a tool. The All-American had sacrificed itself. It had taken the load, absorbed the stress, and destroyed its own structural integrity to keep them safe. It was a mechanical martyrdom. The engineers took pieces of the All-American back to Seattle. They studied the crystallization of the metal fatigue. These studies directly influenced the design of the B-29 Superfortress and later the B-52. The survival of the All-American didn't just save 10 men. It taught Boeing how to build the next generation of indestructible bombers. But for the men standing on the hot Algerian tarmac, the future of aviation didn't matter. What mattered was the realization that their lives had been saved by the smallest of margins. A rivet that didn't pop, a cable that didn't snap, a spar that bent but didn't break. They had looked into the machinery of death and found a flaw in the design. Sometimes, resilience outweighs physics. The war eventually ended. The skies over Europe and Africa fell silent. The B-17 seconds were parked in long rows in the deserts of Arizona, waiting to be smelted into aluminum ingots. The All-American met the same fate as thousands of others crushed into scrap metal. The physical evidence of the miracle was erased. But the men who flew her carried the memory differently. Kenneth Bragg returned to the United States. He lived a long life, but like many veterans of the greatest generation, he rarely spoke of the day he wrestled a broken bomber through the Atlas Mountains. He became a quiet man, a civilian, but those who knew him said that whenever he saw a B-17 at an air show, he would stop and stare at the tail section. He wasn't looking at the plane. He was looking for the ghost of the gap that should have killed them. Sam Sarpolus, the tail gunner, eventually overcame the trauma of the pendulum ride. He returned to civilian life, raised a family, and grew old. But he reportedly never liked sitting with his back to an open window. The sensation of the wind in the abyss never fully left him. In the years that followed, the crew would occasionally reunite. They were no longer the young, terrified men in flight suits. They were grandfathers with gray hair and slower steps. When they gathered, they didn't talk about heroism. They talked about the cold. They talked about the noise. And they talked about the moment the wheel touched the ground at Biskra. They shared a look that only combat veterans understand, the look of men who have seen the other side of the curtain and were allowed to step back. The story of the All-American is more than just a chapter in an aviation textbook. It is the ultimate testament to the human spirit's refusal to accept the inevitable. Physics said they were dead. Aerodynamics said the plane couldn't fly. Common sense said they should bail out. But loyalty said, stay. In a world that often celebrates individual achievement, the All-American reminds us that the greatest feats are often acts of collective stubbornness. 10 men deciding that if they were going to die, they would die together. And because of that decision, because they refused to abandon the man in the tail, they all lived. The B-17 All-American is gone. The metal is recycled. The men have passed on. But the image remains. That black and white photograph of a broken plane flying proud against the sun stands as an eternal defiance of the odds. It whispers to us across the decades. Hold on. Even when you are broken, hold on. If you look closely at that famous photo today, don't just look at the hole in the fuselage. Look at the invisible threads holding that tail in place. Those threads aren't made of aluminum. They are made of brotherhood. This story of the All-American is just one of thousands of forgotten miracles from World War II. These men didn't consider themselves heroes. They were just doing a job, but we have a duty to remember them. If this story of impossible survival moved you, please honor their memory by hitting that like button. It helps us share their legacy with a new generation who needs to hear it. Did Lieutenant Bragg make the right call by refusing to let his crew bail out? Or was it a reckless gamble that paid off? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Type brotherhood if you believe they did the right thing. And if you want to see more stories of pilots who defied physics and soldiers who defied death, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, we are going to uncover the story of a tank commander who fought a duel with a tiger and won. You do not want to miss it. Keep the history alive.